The old piano sat in the corner of Grand Central Station like a forgotten friend. Its black paint was chipped in places, and some of the keys had turned slightly yellow from years of being touched by thousands of different hands, but it still made beautiful music. And that's all that mattered to the man sitting on the worn wooden bench. He looked like any other person you might pass on the street without a second glance. His jeans had a small hole near the left knee, and his jacket was the kind you'd find at a secondhand store for maybe $10. His sneakers were clean but clearly old, with scuff marks that told stories of many long walks. To anyone watching, he was just another guy killing time at the train station. But this wasn't just any guy. This was someone who owned companies worth billions of dollars. Someone whose decisions affected thousands of employees around the world. Someone whose name appeared in business magazines and whose photo hung in boardrooms across the country. Right now, though, none of that mattered. Right now, he was just a tired man who needed to disappear for a while. The past week had been brutal. Lawyers had been calling him every hour with updates about other companies trying to buy his business against his will. Reporters had been camping outside his office building, shouting questions every time he walked past. Board members had been scheduling emergency meetings, their voices tense with worry about stock prices and market reactions. Everyone wanted something from him, and he was exhausted from giving pieces of himself away. That's why he'd done something he hadn't done in years. He'd gone to his closet and pushed past all the expensive suits and silk ties. He'd found clothes he'd forgotten he owned, simple things that made him look ordinary. Then he'd walked out of his penthouse apartment, past his driver, past his security team, and into the city like a regular person. The train station was perfect because it was full of people, who had places to go and things to do. No one had time to really look at anyone else. Commuters rushed past with their phones pressed to their ears. Students hurried by with heavy backpacks, and tourists wandered around taking pictures. In the middle of all this movement, the piano offered a quiet island of peace. He'd been playing for about an hour when a security guard noticed him. The guard was doing his evening rounds, checking that everything was in order before the scheduled concert that was supposed to start soon. The piano was supposed to be reserved for a classical performance. There was already a small crowd gathering in anticipation. The guard walked over slowly, his keys jingling with each step. He was an older man who'd probably been working at the station for years, and he'd seen all kinds of people come and go. He carried a clipboard and wore the kind of serious expression that comes with having to enforce rules all day long. "Excuse me," the guard said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm going to need you to move along. We have a scheduled performance starting in about 15 minutes, and this area needs to be cleared." The man at the piano nodded and started to close the piano lid. He understood. Rules were rules, and he'd had his time with the instrument. But something about the way he moved caught the guard's attention. There was something different about how his hands touched the keys, how he sat on the bench, how he seemed to know exactly where everything was without looking. "You play pretty well," the guard said, his tone softening a little. "Where'd you learn? Long time ago," came the quiet reply. "Different life." The guard studied him more carefully. The man's clothes were definitely worn, and he had that tired look that comes from spending too much time on the streets. But there was something else there too, something in his eyes that didn't quite match the rest of his appearance. It was the look of someone who'd seen the world from many different angles. "Well, you can't stay here," the guard continued, his professional voice returning. "This isn't a place for people to just hang around. Performance tonight is for paying guests, and we need to keep the area clear." A few people nearby had started to notice the conversation. A woman in a business suit glanced over while talking on her phone. A couple with shopping bags slowed their walking to see what was happening. A teenager with headphones around his neck stopped scrolling through his phone and looked up with curiosity. The man at the piano stood up slowly, gathering the small bag he'd placed beside the bench. He moved with quiet dignity, not arguing or causing any fuss. But something about the situation felt wrong to the people watching. Here was someone who clearly loved music being asked to leave, so that others could enjoy the same thing he'd been enjoying peacefully. "Just seems a shame," someone in the small crowd murmured. He wasn't bothering anyone. The guard heard this and felt a need to explain his position. "Look, we have rules for a reason. This piano is donated for community use, but we also have scheduled events. People paid money to hear tonight's performance, and they deserve to have the space prepared properly." The man with the worn clothes said nothing, simply shouldered his bag and prepared to walk away. But as he took a step back from the piano, something made him pause. Maybe it was the way the light was hitting the keys, or maybe it was the memory of how good it had felt to lose himself in the music. Whatever it was, he found himself looking back at the instrument with obvious longing. "One more song?" he asked quietly, turning back to the guard. "Just one, and then I'll go, I promise." Guard shook his head automatically. "Can't do it. The performers will be here any minute, and they need time to set up their music and get ready." But the crowd was growing now, and people were starting to pick sides. Some agreed with the guard that rules needed to be followed. Others felt sorry for the man who just wanted to play music. The tension was building in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. A young woman arrived carrying a violin case and sheet music. She was clearly the scheduled performer, dressed in concert attire and looking professional. She took in the scene quickly, understanding immediately what was happening. Instead of demanding that the space be cleared, she surprised everyone by speaking up. "Let him play one song," she said to the guard. "I don't mind waiting a few more minutes." The guard looked uncertain. This wasn't how things usually went, and he wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. The crowd was getting bigger, and people were starting to pull out their phones. Some were probably hoping to see drama unfold, while others just wanted to see what would happen next. The man at the piano looked around at all the faces watching him. For someone who usually commanded boardrooms full of powerful people, this felt completely different. These were just regular folks going about their daily lives, and somehow he'd become the center of their attention. His heart started beating faster as he realized that whatever he did next would be watched and probably recorded by dozens of people. "Please," he said one more time, his voice barely loud enough for people to hear. "Just one song." The moment stretched out like a held breath. The guard looked at his clipboard, then at the performer who'd said she didn't mind waiting, then at the crowd of people who were all waiting to see what would happen. Everyone seemed to understand that this was about more than just music or rules or schedules. This was about human dignity and the power of art to bring people together. Finally, after what felt like forever, the guard stepped aside and gestured toward the piano bench. The crowd moved closer, phones came out, and the man in the worn clothes sat back down at the piano. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The moment the security guard stepped aside, everything changed. What had been a simple conversation between two people suddenly became a public event. More and more people stopped walking to see what was happening. The evening rush hour crowd was always in a hurry. But something about this scene made them pause. A woman in her 50s wearing expensive jewelry whispered loudly to her teenage daughter, "I don't understand why they're making such a big deal about this." Like the man clearly doesn't belong here. Her voice carried farther than she probably intended, and several people turned to look at her with disapproving expressions. Her daughter looked embarrassed and tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, maybe he just likes music," she said quietly. "Sweetheart, you're too young to understand," the woman replied, adjusting her designer purse. "There are appropriate places for everything, and this isn't the place for people like him to be entertaining themselves." An older gentleman standing nearby couldn't help but speak up. "People like him? What's that supposed to mean?" Last I checked, music was for everyone. The tension in the crowd was growing. Some people agreed with the well-dressed woman, nodding their heads and making comments about proper behavior and following rules. Others seemed offended by her attitude, crossing their arms and shaking their heads in disagreement. The man at the piano could hear everything. Each whispered comment, each judgment, each assumption about who he was and what he deserved. He'd spent most of his adult life insulated from this kind of treatment. When you have money and power, people tend to speak to you very differently. They smile more, agree more, and definitely don't suggest that you don't belong somewhere. But sitting there in his thrift store clothes, he was experiencing what millions of people face every day. He was being judged not by his character or his abilities, but by his appearance and assumed social status. It was a harsh reminder of how the world really worked for most people. The young performer with the violin case watched all of this unfold. With growing discomfort, she had come to the station excited about her performance, but now she felt caught in the middle of something much bigger than music. She could see the hurt in the man's eyes, even though he was trying to hide it. "Know what?" she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I think we could all use some music right now. The world would be a better place if we had more of it, not less." Her words seemed to give permission for people to choose sides more openly. A construction worker, still wearing his hard hat from the job site, called out, "Yeah, let the man play. What's the harm?" A business executive, checking his expensive watch, shook his head. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today. No respect for rules or proper procedures." The security guard stood in the middle of it all, looking more and more uncomfortable. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he'd started his shift. He was just trying to do his job. But somehow, he'd become the center of a debate about fairness and human dignity. "Look, everyone," he said, raising his voice to address the growing crowd. "I'm just following the rules here. We have scheduled events, and people have expectations." But the lady said she doesn't mind waiting, called out a college student with a backpack full of textbooks. "Why can't we just let him play one song?" The crowd was getting bigger by the minute. People were pulling out their phones, some too. Record what was happening, others to check social media or text their friends about the scene unfolding at Grand Central. The whole situation was taking on a life of its own. The man at the piano felt his heart racing. In boardrooms, he was used to being the center of attention, but this was completely different. Those were controlled environments where he had power and influence. Here he was just another person whose fate was being decided by the opinions of strangers. He looked down at his hands resting on the piano keys. These were the same hands that had signed contracts worth millions of dollars, that had shaken hands with world leaders that had built an empire from nothing. But right now, they were just the hands of someone asking for permission to make music. "Maybe we should take a vote," suggested someone from the back of the crowd. This idea seemed to catch on quickly, with people murmuring their agreement. "Ridiculous," snapped the woman with the expensive jewelry. "We don't take votes on following basic rules and maintaining proper standards." "What standards?" asked a young mother holding her toddler's hand. "The standard of treating people with kindness? The standard of sharing public spaces?" The debate was getting more heated. People who had never met before were now arguing passionately about fairness, rules, social norms, and human decency. The train station, usually a place where people minded their own business and hurried to their destinations, had become an impromptu forum for discussing some of society's biggest issues. The young performer decided she'd heard enough. She walked directly to the security guard and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sir, I'm the scheduled performer tonight. I'm officially requesting that this gentleman be allowed to play one song before I begin. Is that acceptable?" The guard looked relieved to have a clear resolution offered. "Well, if the scheduled performer doesn't object, then I suppose we can make an exception." But this didn't satisfy everyone in the crowd. "This sets a terrible precedent," declared the business executive. "Next thing you know, every homeless person in the city will think they can just take over public facilities whenever they want." "He's not taking over anything," responded the construction worker, his voice rising with irritation. "He's just asking to play music on a public piano. That's what it's there for." The man at the piano realized that no matter what happened next, this moment had already changed something important. These people were talking about him, but they were really talking about much bigger things. They were talking about how we treat each other, about who deserves respect, about what it means to be part of a community. He thought about all the times he'd walked past people without really seeing them, all the times he'd made assumptions based on appearances, the times he'd been too busy or too important to notice the humanity in everyone around him. "Thank you," he said quietly to the young performer. "Thank you for standing up for me." She smiled at him with genuine warmth. Music brings people together. That's what it's supposed to do. The crowd was starting to settle down, but the energy in the air was still electric. Everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special, though they might not have been able to put their finger on exactly what it was. Some people had their phones ready to record. Others were checking the time, wondering if they would miss their trains. A few were already sharing the story on social media, describing the scene to friends and followers who weren't there to see it themselves. The man at the piano took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the keys. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see what would happen next. Some of those eyes belonged to people who supported him, others to people who thought he shouldn't be there at all. But as he prepared to play, he realized that none of that really mattered. What mattered was the music, and what music could do to change hearts and minds. What mattered was showing everyone watching that worth isn't determined by clothes or appearances or assumptions. His hands hovered over the keys for just a moment longer, and then he began to play. The first note rang out like a clear bell through the busy train station. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if the man at the piano was testing whether the instrument would respond to his touch. But there was something in that single note that made everyone stop what they were doing. The businessman who had been checking his watch looked up from his phone. The mother with the toddler stopped mid-step. Even the teenagers who had been absorbed in their own conversations turned toward the piano. There was a quality to the sound that seemed to cut through all the noise and chatter of the station. Then came the second note, and the third. The man's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that surprised everyone watching. This wasn't someone just playing around or showing off. This was someone who understood music in a way that most people never would. The piece he chose was something beautiful and sad at the same time. It started quietly, like a whisper, but every note was perfectly placed. His left hand created a steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, while his right hand danced above it, telling a story without words. The woman, with the expensive jewelry, had been preparing to leave, convinced that this would be a waste of her time. But something about the music made her pause. Her daughter noticed the change in her mother's expression and watched as the harsh lines around her eyes began to soften. "Mom," the teenager whispered, "he's really good." Her mother didn't respond at first. She was too busy listening, too busy being surprised by what she was hearing. This wasn't what she had expected at all. This was the kind of playing you might hear in a concert hall. Not from someone in worn clothes sitting at a public piano. The construction worker had been ready to defend the piano player against anyone who tried to stop him, but now he found himself completely absorbed in the music. He worked with his hands every day, building things, creating things, and he recognized the skill it took to make something beautiful. What this man was doing with the piano was no different from what a master craftsman might do with wood or stone. As the music continued, more people began to gather. Word was spreading through the station that something special was happening. Commuters who had been rushing to catch trains slowed down, then stopped completely. Tourists forgot about their maps and guidebooks. Even the station employees began to drift over from their posts. The young performer with the violin case stood transfixed. She had studied music her entire life, had spent countless hours practicing and perfecting her technique. She knew good playing when she heard it, and this was extraordinary. The man at the piano wasn't just hitting the right notes at the right time. He was putting his entire soul into the music. The piece he was playing seemed to tell the story of a long journey. There were moments of joy and triumph, but also passages that spoke of loneliness and struggle. The music rose and fell like waves, sometimes gentle and comforting, sometimes powerful and overwhelming. A businessman in a three-piece suit found himself thinking about his father, who had played piano when he was a child. He hadn't thought about those evening concerts in their living room for years, but the music brought back memories of sitting next to his dad on the piano bench, trying to learn simple melodies. A college student studying for exams felt tears forming in her eyes, though she couldn't quite explain why. There was something in the music that spoke to all the stress and pressure she'd been feeling, all the uncertainty about her future. But there was also hope there, a reminder that beautiful things still existed in the world. The security guard, who had originally asked the man to leave, now stood watching with his mouth slightly open. In all his years working at the station, he had heard hundreds of people play the public piano. Most were beginners just having fun. Some were decent players showing off for friends. But this was something completely different. The music grew more complex as the man's confidence increased. His fingers moved faster across the keys, but every note was still crystal clear. He wasn't showing off or trying to impress anyone. He was simply letting the music flow through him, sharing something precious with everyone who was willing to. Listen, an elderly woman who had been sitting on a nearby bench waiting for her train stood up and moved closer. She had grown up during a time when live music was more common, when families gathered around pianos in their homes for entertainment. This reminded her of those simpler times when music was about bringing people together rather than something you just listened to through headphones. The crowd continued to grow. People were texting their friends, calling family members, posting on social media about what they were witnessing. But even as phones came out to record the moment, there was a respectful silence. Everyone seemed to understand that they were experiencing something rare and special. A janitor pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies stopped his work to listen. He had been invisible to most of the people in the station all day, just another worker doing his job. But the music made him feel seen, made him feel like his appreciation mattered just as much as anyone else's. The man at the piano seemed to have forgotten about everything except the music. His eyes were closed now, his head moving slightly with the rhythm.
Wow.
The stress lines that had been visible on his face earlier had disappeared. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he looked completely at peace. The music told a story of transformation. It started with uncertainty and doubt, moved through conflict and struggle, and was now building toward something hopeful and triumphant. The audience could feel it coming, could sense that the piece was approaching its climax. A teenager who had been skeptical about the whole situation found himself completely captivated. He had never been particularly interested in classical music, but there was something about hearing it performed live, seeing the emotion on the player's face, that made it feel completely different from anything he'd experienced before. The young, scheduled performer realized that she was witnessing something that would change how she thought about music forever. This wasn't about technical perfection or following the rules exactly as written. This was about communicating directly with other human beings, about using music as a bridge between souls. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, the energy in the station seemed to shift. The music was building to something powerful and beautiful, and everyone could feel it coming. People leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting to see how this musical journey would end. The man's hands moved across the keys with increasing intensity, but there was still a gentleness there, a respect for the instrument, and for the music itself. He was giving everything he had to this moment, pouring out years of hidden emotion and suppressed creativity. The final notes were approaching. Everyone in the crowd seemed to sense it. This magical moment was almost over, but its impact would last much longer. People were already looking at each other differently, seeing past surface appearances to the humanity underneath, and then, with a series of soft, perfect notes, the music came to an end. The man's hands lifted from the keys, and for a moment, the entire station was completely silent. The silence that followed the last note was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced in Grand Central Station. It wasn't the usual quiet of people minding their own business or the brief pause between train announcements. This was something deeper, more meaningful. It was the kind of silence that comes when something truly extraordinary has just happened, for several heartbeats. Nobody moved. The man at the piano sat perfectly still, his hands resting gently on his knees, his eyes still closed, as if he was holding on to the last echoes of the music. The crowd around him seemed frozen in time, processing what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. It was the elderly woman who had moved closer during the performance, and her applause was soft but steady. Within seconds, others joined in. The college student, the construction worker, the businessman in the three-piece suit, they all began clapping with genuine appreciation. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic. People were smiling, some were wiping tears from their eyes, and a few were shaking their heads in amazement. Even the woman with the expensive jewelry was clapping, though she looked surprised at herself for doing so. "That was incredible," someone called out from the crowd. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The man at the piano opened his eyes and looked around at all the faces watching him. He seemed almost surprised to find himself there, as if the music had transported him somewhere else entirely. He stood up slowly and gave a small, humble bow to acknowledge the applause. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the continuing claps and cheers. "Thank you for listening." The young performer who had originally been scheduled to play walked up to him with her violin case still in hand. Her eyes were wide with amazement, and she looked like she had just witnessed something that would change her understanding of music forever. "I've been studying music my whole life," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I've heard some of the best players in the world, but that was something else entirely. That wasn't just playing, that was like watching someone's soul speak through the piano." The man smiled at her words, clearly touched by her genuine appreciation. "Music has always been my refuge," he said simply. "When everything else gets complicated, the piano never lies." But as the applause continued and more people pressed closer to congratulate him, something unexpected happened. A businessman in the crowd was staring at the piano player with a puzzled expression on his face. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through something, comparing what he was seeing on his screen to the man standing in front of him. "Wait a minute," the businessman said, his voice getting louder as his certainty grew. "I know you. I've seen your picture before." The piano player's expression changed slightly, a flicker of something that might have been worry crossing his face. But the businessman continued, his excitement building as he made the connection. "You're the CEO of that tech company. It's the one that's been in the news all week about the takeover attempts." He held up his phone, showing a news article with a photo. "This is you, isn't it?" The crowd's energy shifted as people began to understand what the businessman was suggesting. They looked back and forth between the phone screen and the man in the worn clothes standing by the piano. Some people pulled out their own phones, searching for news articles and images to confirm what they were hearing. "That's impossible," said the woman with the expensive jewelry, but her voice lacked conviction. "That man is one of the richest people in the country. He wouldn't be here dressed like ... like that." But as more people searched online and found photos, the evidence became undeniable. The facial features matched perfectly. The eyes, the smile, even the way he carried himself, it all lined up with the pictures they were finding on their phones. "Oh my goodness," whispered the young performer. "You really are him, aren't you?" The man who had been judged for his appearance just minutes earlier nodded slowly. There was no point in denying it anymore. His moment of anonymity was over, but strangely, he didn't feel upset about it. Instead, he felt relieved. The music had done something that no amount of money or power ever could. It had shown these people who he really was, underneath everything else. "Why?" asked the security guard, his voice filled with confusion. "Why would someone like you dress up like? Why would you pretend to be?" "I wasn't pretending to be anyone," the man replied gently. "These are just clothes. Underneath them, I'm the same person, whether I'm wearing a $1,000 suit or a $10 jacket from a thrift store." The construction worker who had defended him earlier started laughing, but it wasn't a mocking laugh. It was the kind of laughter that comes from understanding something profound. "So you're telling me that one of the richest guys in America just got hassled for looking homeless?" "And played the most beautiful music I've ever heard," added the college student. The crowd was buzzing with excitement and disbelief. People were sharing the story on social media in real time, posting videos they had recorded and photos they had taken. The hashtags were already starting to spread across different platforms as the story took on a life of its own. But something interesting was happening among the people who had actually been there to witness the performance. Instead of being starstruck or asking for selfies or autographs, they seemed more interested in talking about the music and what it had made them feel. "I don't care how much money you have," said the elderly woman who had started the applause. "What you did with that piano was a gift to all of us. That's what matters." The teenager whose mother had complained about him being there looked at her mom with an expression that clearly said, "I told you so." Her mother, for her part, looked genuinely embarrassed about her earlier comments. "I owe you an apology," the woman said, walking up to the piano player. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and I was completely wrong."
What?
"You just shared with us was beautiful." "We all make assumptions," he replied kindly. "I've made plenty of them myself. It's part of what tonight taught me too." The young performer was still processing everything she had witnessed. "This is going to change everything, isn't it?" People are going to want to know why you were here, why you were dressed like this, why you chose to play for strangers in a train station. Maybe that's not a bad thing, he said, looking around at all the faces in the crowd. Maybe people need to be reminded that music doesn't care about your bank account or your job title or what kind of clothes you wear. Music just cares about what's in your heart. The businessman who had first recognized him was still staring in amazement. This is going to be the biggest story of the year, he said. A billionaire, dressed like a regular person, playing piano in Grand Central Station. But that's not the real story, said the construction worker. The real story is that we almost missed out on something amazing because we were too busy judging someone by how they looked. As the crowd began to thin out and people started remembering their trains and appointments, the impact of what had happened was already spreading far beyond the train station. Videos were being uploaded, articles were being written, and millions of people who hadn't been there were about to learn about the night. When music reminded everyone that appearances can be deceiving and that true worth comes from what you give to the world, not what you own. 3 months had passed since that evening at Grand Central Station, but the impact was still growing every day. The video of the billionaire's piano performance had been watched over 50 million times across different social media platforms. News stations had covered the story for weeks, and it had sparked conversations about judgment, appearance, and human dignity in living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces around the world. But the real changes weren't happening in the digital world. They were happening in the hearts and minds of real people, starting with those who had been there that night. The security guard who had originally asked the man to leave. The piano bench had become something of a local celebrity himself. Reporters had tracked him down to hear his side of the story, and he'd been invited to speak at community events about treating everyone with respect. That night changed how I see my job, he told a group of high school students during a presentation. About bullying and judgment. I realized that being in charge of keeping order doesn't mean being unkind to people. Now, when I see someone who looks like they might be having a hard time, I ask if they need help instead of assuming they're causing trouble. The woman who had made the harsh comments about the piano player had also become an unexpected advocate. For change, she'd been so affected by the experience that she started volunteering at a local homeless shelter, getting to know the people she had once dismissed without a second thought. I was so wrong that night, she admitted during a television interview. I thought I could tell everything about a person just by looking at them. Now I know that everyone has a story, and everyone deserves kindness, regardless of how they're dressed or where they come from. Her teenage daughter had shared the story at school, and it had inspired her entire class to start a project about not judging people by appearances. They created presentations, wrote essays, and even organized events to raise awareness about homelessness and social prejudice. The young performer who had been scheduled to play that night had seen her career take an unexpected turn. The grace and kindness she had shown by defending the piano player had impressed many people in the music industry. She'd been offered opportunities to perform at major venues and had even recorded an album that included a piece inspired by that. Evening at the train station. That night taught me that music isn't about perfect technique or following all the rules, she said during a radio interview. It's about connecting with people, about sharing something real and meaningful. When I perform now, I think about how music can bring people together, just like it did that night. The billionaire himself had returned to his corporate responsibilities, but he was a changed man. The experience of being judged for his appearance had given him a new perspective on how his companies treated their employees and customers. He'd implemented policies to ensure that hiring decisions were based on qualifications and character rather than superficial factors. More importantly, he'd established a foundation dedicated to bringing music education to underserved communities. The foundation provided free instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities to anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their background or ability to pay. Music saved my life that night, he explained during the foundation's launch event. Not because I played it, but because it reminded me of what really matters. I want to make sure that everyone has access to that same healing power. The public piano at Grand Central Station had become a pilgrimage site of sorts. People came from all over the world to play it, to listen to others play, and to remember the lesson about not judging people by their appearance. The station had installed a small plaque near the piano that read, "Music speaks all languages and knows no social boundaries." Every evening, There was now an informal concert at the piano. Office workers would stop on their way home to listen. Tourists would gather to experience something uniquely New York. Students would come to practice and share their music with strangers. The piano had become a symbol of unity and understanding. The construction worker who had defended the piano player that night often stopped by during his commute home. Sometimes he would listen to others play, and sometimes he would share stories about that memorable evening with newcomers who hadn't heard about what happened. It just goes to show you, he would tell anyone who would listen, you never know who you're talking to or what they might teach you. That guy could have gotten angry or defensive when people were judging him. But instead, he just played the most beautiful music any of us had ever heard. The elderly woman who had started the applause had become a regular at the evening piano sessions. She would often bring her grandchildren, using the story as a way to teach them about kindness and keeping an open mind about people. Your grandmother learned something important that night. She would tell them, I learned that respect isn't something you give to people because of what they own or what they look like. Respect is something every person deserves just because they're human. The college student who had been moved to tears by the performance had switched her major to music therapy after that night. She was now working with elderly patients in nursing homes, using music to help them connect with memories and emotions. Realize that music isn't just entertainment, she explained to her supervisor. It's medicine for the soul. That night at the train station showed me how powerful music can be in bringing out the best in people. Schools across the country had started using the story as part of their curriculum about empathy and social awareness. Teachers would show the video and then lead discussions about assumptions, prejudice, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The story had even inspired changes in corporate policies. Many companies had reviewed their dress codes and customer service training, recognizing that judging people based on appearance could mean missing out on valuable relationships and opportunities. But perhaps the most meaningful change was happening in small, everyday interactions. People who had heard the story were more likely to smile at strangers, to offer help to someone who looked different from them, to listen to street musicians, and to remember that everyone they met was fighting battles they knew nothing about. Businessman who had first recognized the piano player that night had started a mentorship program at his company, specifically designed to help people from different backgrounds succeed in the business world. He'd realized that talent and character came in all forms, and that his company was stronger when it included diverse perspectives. That night taught me that some of our best ideas and biggest opportunities might come from the people we least expect, he told his employees during a company meeting. Now we look for potential in everyone, not just the people who fit our traditional image of success. As the months passed, the story continued to spread and inspire new acts of kindness and understanding. The piano performance had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact was immeasurable. It had reminded the world that music truly is a universal language, and that the most valuable things in life, kindness, talent, compassion, and human connection, can't be measured by bank accounts or designer clothes. The man who had sat down at a public piano in worn clothes and turned a moment of judgment into a lesson about humanity had given the world something priceless, a reminder that everyone deserves respect, and that beautiful surprises can come from the most unexpected places. And every evening, as commuters and visitors gathered around the piano at Grand Central Station to listen to whoever happened to be playing, they carried that lesson with them into their daily lives, spreading it one interaction at a time.